Hey guys, and welcome to the lighting segment of Mastering Lighting Lesson 5. I'm, I've really, I've tried to come back strong here. I've tried to, I've done my best to make this the lesson I always wanted it to be. It took a lot of grinding, but there's no excuses. I've just gotta keep going at it. But I really appreciate the faith you've kept in me, and I'll try and live up to that. And in this lesson, we're going to be taking a deep look at the still life photography from Anatoly Chi and go in and try and recreate the artistic look and feel to his projects. I've never felt as passionate about another artist's work as I have about Anatoly's, because there was just something unique about it to me, and I feel like his work represented everything that was lacking in my arsenal of tools. His deep understanding of composition, his understanding of how to color lights and put focus on different objects by occluding light sources, and even just on a more subtle level of just the way he arranges the scenes, and really has a mastery of every step of the process, then going into the retouching side of things and just further fixing things up and giving his images that really nice grade that just looks so natural and soft and real. And something about that that combination of talent that he has just made me really want to try and recreate it in CGI. So I've done my best in this lesson to arrange it in a logical manner where I break it down like I did with the V-Ray course, from simple theory up to the complex way in which you can kind of set the whole scene up together. I've had to think outside the box to do this lesson. I didn't expect I was going to be doing anything like this on the lighting course, but when I truly be completely honest with myself, there wasn't enough theory, and I think I was going to run out of information to drop in the lesson very quickly if I didn't learn an entirely new skill set. So that's why this lesson has meant a lot to me, and I really do mean that. Like I've gone out, done so much photography to try and make this happen, and really be able to back up what I'm saying and not just base it off just a couple of jobs I've experimented with. So let's get into it and take a look at some of Anatoly's work, and you'll start to see maybe how strongly I feel about his stuff. He's been a massive help to me. I've been in contact with him, and it's very rare you meet people like that, complete strangers that are happy just to share how they've done things and why they've done things. He's a true artist. Now, as you guys know, this isn't the first time I've attempted to create the scene, so the first thing I'm going to kind of clear out of the way, I wasn't going to mention it, but I thought, you know what, it's important to go back over the old stuff to see where you can improve in, because if anything, at least you guys get to see the mindset I'm in when I'm trying to improve my own work. Now, one last thing, I've recorded this lesson at every single hour in the day, so my voice changes, the position of the mic changes, and I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to try and fix that in a later lesson by getting the mic locked off and connected to the monitor.
What you're seeing up on the screen right now is my very first attempt, and this is just straight from V-Ray. There's no adjustments done, there's no extra layers added, and at the time, I was actually pretty happy with this. I saw that there was quite a few flaws and inconsistencies, but if I just go in now and take a quick look at the high res and kind of point out to you the areas that I was happy with, you'll notice that most of those are to do with the shaders, and obviously that's my expertise, and I put quite a lot of effort into breaking that down, and that's also why I released the shading lesson first, because that was one of the areas that I was genuinely happy with. I will say though that in the beauty render I was having quite a lot of issues just physically getting the damn scene to render. So what I did is I went back to utilizing a more simple shader for the main water jug here, just so that it would render. I had some issues. I was utilizing the curvature map from Boomer Labs, and that was crashing the render. So straight away, even though I was just pretty much happy just to get a beauty render out, because I was having such difficulty rendering it at the time. Now I should also point out that this was rendered with V-Ray 3.4, and the new version is basically a showcase of what V-Ray 3.5 can do. It's a massive new update Chaos Group is just about to release, and that I've been beta testing throughout this whole time, and I can only say amazing things about it. Pretty much from every facet, to shaders, to render speed, to simple bug fixes. It's a much better version to use. So let me just go in now, and I'll show you where I was genuinely happy with the different elements. The foggy glass was one of the areas that I thought I executed the best, especially the liquids within them. It had a really nice lifelike feel to it where it was solid. It maybe looked like there was a bit of fogginess. I'd also figured out how to do this slime shader using the standard V-Ray material. If we go up to the berries here, I utilized the V-Ray scatter volume shader. So for all the different subsurface elements, I was actually working with different V-Ray shaders that have their own strengths and weaknesses. Some of the shaders in the scene relied on my workflow that I break down in the finale of Mastering V-Ray, where it's more of a texturing based workflow, and other shaders rely on more of a procedural approach, like the gold and metals. As you can see here, I heavily rely on the V-Ray dirt to achieve those effects, but I should point out this wasn't the actual final anyway. One of the other things that I was pretty happy with was the chromatic aberration in the refractive liquid where the grapes are going here, and that's just utilizing the V-Ray ab number setting in the V-Ray's refraction. I thought that gave it a really nice realistic appearance, and on top of that, just the amount of detail that I'd put into the scene I thought really showed. I really tried to go next level with that and break down a scene that had enough detail to truly be believable at high res. The issue with that though is that when you start to add more and more detail, it's very weird how the CGI industry works. As you get closer to realism and as you begin to add more and more, that uncanny valley gets deeper and deeper, and what happens is you start to notice all the flaws with the things that don't hold up. So one of the things I wasn't happy with at all were the flowers here. You can see the geometry and the way they're scattered. It just doesn't look very believable high res. But once again, just like everything else in the scene, there were some good elements and some bad. I really liked the smaller flowers and the leaves, generating that nice bit of translucency. I saw potential in the cobwebs that I made, but obviously due to rendering issues and V-Ray 3.4 being a lot slower for a scene like this, I just couldn't manage to get them noise free. So you can see at the high res, they just really break apart. It doesn't look very good at all. Talking about detail, I really liked how I went in and scattered actual dust particles on the wood bench. I thought that just added a nice level of softness to the texture and picked up lighting a little bit differently. If I zoom in real close, you can really see that effect happening right here, where you've got the individual particles reflecting and making it look like the surface isn't completely flat and 2D. I went in and I relied on adding a couple of smaller bits of detail that you wouldn't really notice, like these branches up here, just to maybe make the scene feel a little bit more creepy. And one of the last elements that I'm going to focus on is the dust particles in the air, which, although in theory I thought were going to look pretty good, once again the sampling just really killed that for me, and I just thought that they looked a bit sharp and it was kind of taking the attention away from certain things. They were just catching too much light. Now, if I'm talking about the things that I didn't like in the scene, you can see there's just, once again, a general inconsistency between the different elements. Some things look good, and some things look really bad. You've got like the matchboxes here, which look completely fake. Some of the scaling was even wrong. Just different things not being the right scale compared to each other, which kind of threw off the overall composition of the scene. Like the candle here, I just thought that was quite small. But overall, I was genuinely happy with it. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to show you the finished result, which had all of the retouching layers over the top. And this is my number one issue with the very first attempt. It relied way too much on the retouching. So as you can see, when I add all of the layers over the top, and let me just open this up, this is just some of them. This is just the 32-bit file. I actually collapse this down and then go even further in the 8-bit, just adding a few more color grading adjustments that you can't do in 8-bit. So as you can see, all these different layers here, just to build up the scene, I'm relying heaps on alphas for every single part of the scene, just adjusting brightness, color, hue, and saturation. And what that reveals is that the raw beauty just isn't good enough. And when I'm trying to make a course for you guys, it has to be reproducible. And what you're seeing here simply isn't reproducible. I'm sure there are some of you guys that are experienced enough to be able to take something from this, but my goal is to make a lesson where you can get the result in the beauty and then rely way less on the grading and final post-work adjustments to get it over the line. I definitely never started the course expecting you guys to have to build up such a complicated retouch file, because it's not even CG anymore at that point. We're just getting into basically a retouching course. So that was really killing me, and I really wanted to avoid that in the second attempt. And I'm happy to say that I did. Now that doesn't mean that I haven't gone in and retouched the second scene and put a bit of effort into that. It's just not so needed. Now you can see the new version which I've created, which has attempted to keep the good elements and fix up the bad ones. So I didn't just completely start from scratch, and that's an important note to make, because even though I'm highly critical of my work, it still pays off to be selective about your criticism, because if you simply hate all of it, the next time you do similar work, you may not have made strong enough mental notes to actually improve upon some of the worst areas. So we're going to get started on this lesson, and I'm going to break down what I consider to be the most important aspect of any still life scene, and that's the composition. Now, in order to understand and learn a little bit more about this subject, I looked over Anatoly's work quite a lot and started making mental notes about the consistencies between his projects. One of the things I love most about still life photography is how intimately the lighting and the composition have to work together. And that's because most of the time the subject matter is primarily lit with a small directional light source, either naturally via the sun or windows, or artificially with colored spotlights. Now what this type of lighting does is it highlights the forms and the silhouettes of the objects, so everything is very pronounced. Now as you can see here in my scene, we have very strong top-down directional lighting, and what this is doing is it's bringing out a lot more depth in the objects because we've got stronger contrast between the highlights and the shadows. Now this is extremely important in still life photography because we don't actually have much physical space width in order to create depth, so you have to create the illusion of depth with that strong lighting. What I mean is that if you were working with a landscape project or something a little bit bigger with more physical depth in the scene, you don't necessarily need such strong lighting because the perspective lines of the scene itself can draw you in. So say you've got a horizon in the distance here, and it's 200 meters away, all the perspective lines can draw you in. But with still life photography, it's very flat and you've got a very narrow frame to work with. Now I actually feel like this simplifies the composition process because what it does is it forces you to contain all of the objects within the key light's hotspot radius. Now as you can see, if I just draw this in here for you, all of the objects are contained, and that just made it easier for me to determine where I wanted the objects to go. But that still doesn't answer the most important question of all. How do you know how to choose which items you want highlighted, and more specifically, where to place the objects within that cone? Now, of course, there's pure creative choice here, and your options are pretty much unlimited. However, from what I've learned about studying still life photography, and Anatoly's work specifically, he consistently places the more detailed objects near the center of the image, or wherever the light source is actually strongest, because in not every single scene, you're going to have light coming directly down from the center. Sometimes it's pushed more to the left, other times it's pushed more to the right, and even sometimes you might get scenarios where there's multiple sources of hot light kind of spilling down onto the scene. I think that's an important thing to note because even though I'm working with a more simple version where the light is directly center, if you want to go and make your own and you're experimenting with where you're placing the light, that does slightly alter where you want to place your hero objects. So if you stick to those basic rules, I think it's going to make it a lot easier for you to dictate where you want the viewer's attention to actually go, which is an extremely important skill in all artwork, not just still life photography. The only way to really drive this point home, though, is by showing you Anatoly's work and pointing out those consistencies. So in this first image from Anatoly, I'll just let you view the image for a few seconds and kind of process what's going on, and then I'll break down what I personally think is happening here. So one of the very first things I noticed about Anatoly's work was that he overlaps things and everything's connected in some way, shape, or form. It's very, very, very rare that he'll have different groups of objects totally separated from the background. So let me explain what I mean here. If we work from left to right, you can see that every single object is connected to the next object. So as we go up here, we go to the right, the apple's connected to the jar, these two apples are connected, then the third jar is connected. As we go right, everything's connected, and it kind of like maps out the composition for you. Now at first, I made the observation, but I wasn't really sure of what that was doing. So I began to experiment in 3D, and what I realized was happening is by clumping all of the objects together, it makes your attention focus more on the objects and less on the surrounding space. It's basically forcing you to view where the objects are, because the silhouette is all connected. Now if I go over to some of his other works, you'll see this happening again and again. All of the objects have their own space and they're connected one by one, just like so. And once again, it forces you to focus on the objects because you're vignetting the scene with the background and the lighting. We go to the next one. Once again, everything's overlapping and you start to kind of piece it all together and you see that there's a reoccurring theme going on here. Everything's clumped and separated from the background. This one is my favorite work of Anatoly's, and it's just incredibly detailed. Once again, everything's touching, everything's separated off the background. Now, the second thing I noticed with Anatoly's work and still life photography is that usually the most detailed objects are positioned in the most intensely lit areas of the scene. So what we can see here in this scene is that the leaves, which are obviously the most detailed, are catching that main hero light coming from the top left. And the first thing I do when analyzing a scene like this now is obviously try to reverse engineer how it was being lit, and we can do that simply by looking at the directionality of the shadows. So we know that because it's kind of lit from top to bottom and the shadows are going in this direction, there's obviously some kind of light source hitting the scene here, maybe even hitting the back wall, heading a little bit backwards in this direction. But essentially, if you look closely, all the most detailed areas are in the direct path of that really strong light. One little subtle thing to notice here is that this can dictate how you actually place the objects a lot more precisely. For example, with the candle here, Anatoly didn't really have much choice to put it anywhere else, because if you move the candle more left, you'll notice what's happening on the cork here. It's being completely put into shadow. So he's had to move that candle just out of the way of the shadow from the hero element. And this just once again adds this really nice highlight on the top of the candle, which brings it off the background. So this is quite a reoccurring theme in Anatoly's work. So once again, I'll just go through and take a look at some of the other works. Straight away, you notice that the hero object and the most detailed object is smack in the center of the scene, catching the light directly from the hero lighting source. Then we've got other things like this really nice detailed jug, which have also been placed directly in the crosshairs of that main hero light. Now all of the lesser objects that he doesn't want detailed, he just lets those spill to the side and lets them be cast in shadow. As you can see here, we've got like jugs and other kettle pot type things, the fruit over to the left. These are all secondary items, and all the hero items which are really interesting, he places them directly in front. Let's move over to the next image. Once again, the flowers are very detailed, and he just places those directly in the path of light. Because the flower pot is casting shadows, it doesn't leave him much choice with where to put the skull head. So he has to move that to the right so that it can catch the light from the top as well. Now that covers the first two techniques I noticed. The third was that once again, and I said this earlier on, all of the objects are sitting directly within the main cone of light. Where that hotspot is hitting, that's where you include all of your hero objects. And if I go through Anatoly's work once again, you'll see that that's one of the more obvious features. In this scene here, the directionality of the light is very strong, and that's where he's keeping all of the objects contained. Once again, you can see here that they're all sitting in that nice area. He doesn't put any of the objects you can see in the shadow down here. He's not putting any objects in these areas. They're all free. You can kind of start to get a feel for how this is working. This is one of the more obvious ones because you can literally see the fall off from where the light's hitting the scene. Now those first three techniques I'd say are essential for setting up your still life scene, but there is still one more different thing that I implemented into my own scene, and this doesn't necessarily reflect everything that Anatoly is doing, but it's something that I was aware of even before studying his work. And that's when you have a scene which is relatively flat, like I was saying earlier, you don't have the distance-based perspective lines to create depth. One of the things you can do to enhance that and make the viewer kind of focus on different areas of the scene is by making sure all the objects occupy a different space vertically. So what I'll do is I'll just start by putting a line on the table here, and then I'll just work my way up, and you'll see that, let me just go back and make this a little bit bigger here. So that as I work my way up from the bottom glass jar here, then over to this one here, then here, here, here. See, I just get into a little bit more of the detail. Trying to offset everything, and even though some things can be close, nothing is sitting on the exact same horizontal plane. And this was the last thing I did with my composition. Right at the end, there were a couple of things that were sitting together exactly. Like I had this jug here, which was brought a little bit more forward, and this beaker at the back was a bit bigger, and they were sitting on the exact same plane. And just to separate that off a little bit and break up the symmetry of the scene, I just offset those, like so. And that was pretty much where I wrapped up my understanding of Anatoly's work and my own composition. And I felt like I had a much stronger understanding of where to place things in future projects because I actually went in and tried to figure out how he was positioning the objects. There's obviously a method to the madness, and if I just take one last quick look through his work, you'll see that that style remains consistent of tying together all of the objects with the lighting. So just to recap those 4 steps again, you want to make sure that all items overlap and are clumped together against the background. The detailed or the hero objects, make sure you're placing those directly in the path of the hero light source. All items should technically be clumped inside the hero light source's direct lighting area or cone. And all objects ideally have their own position in vertical space offset from each other. Now the goal in this project is to recreate the look and feel of one of Anatoly's works. Now because there's quite a lot of subtle things that go into producing an image like this, I'm not going to jump straight into the final lighting for the final project. I'm going to work my way up through a couple of different examples and break down some of the most important things that Anatoly does and explain how they affect the scene. So as usual, the very first thing I'm going to do is take a really deep and close look at Anatoly's reference and body of work so that I can start to figure out what I need to do to achieve a similar result. The thing I love about Anatoly's work is that from artwork to artwork, the lighting remains fairly consistent. And if you try and get in his head, you can start to understand that to him, it's more about expressing the artwork through the composition and the objects he selects, as well as the color grading. But in terms of actually where the lights are positioned, how intense they are, and the amount of lights he's using, it's all very similar, which makes it a lot easier to study his work and not get confused because you're not seeing totally different light setups from image to image. Now, even though, and this is the mastery of Anatoly's work, even though all these projects might seem like they're being naturally lit, all of them are artificially lit to some extent. He's using some kind of flash fill light or reflector to bounce light into the scene, either coming directly from that window light source where a sun is, or one of the trickier things that can be done is by placing a light in front of the window to simulate the sun, so you get a combination of the sun and the window together. Now I don't have any examples up of that, but I am going to get through that as I work my way through this lighting section. So from here, I had to branch out and start looking at some reference of how these sets are constructed off screen, because no matter how much you look at Anatoly's work, it doesn't reveal to you what's going on off screen. The only way you can figure that out is by utilizing the reflections of some of the glass objects in the scene. But because they're so grungy and small, even that's quite difficult to figure out. But there are hints here and there, like you can see these little white reflectors, and I'm going to get to that as well as we kind of go closer and closer to imitating his work. But the next thing I did is I started to search for actual still life sets. So I did a Google search for still life set and started working my way through the reference to try and get a better understanding of the physical studio setup that he was using. And the first thing I encountered when doing this was that there was way too much variation between the reference here to truly get an idea of how he's actually setting up the lights. You know, there's just so much variation from lighting setup to lighting setup. In some situations you can see that it's all studio with, you know, really artificial setups. In other situations it's all naturally lit, and in some situations it's a combination of the both. So at this point I actually got really lucky. Now the way Google works is every so often it'll update its index and you'll get a completely different search result. Now I found, searching for still life set, an image that was really close to Anatoly's work. The problem is that when I went back and tried to re-record the section with some more detailed information, the image wasn't actually returning a result. I couldn't find the image again. So what I had to do is I had to take a screenshot from my recording and do a reverse image search in Google, which led me down a much better path of finding some accurate reference. So what you can do is, say I just drag a random image into the Google image result here. What this is going to do is it's going to return a result of similar images that it thinks it's found. Now what happened is when I searched for that particular image, it led me down a different path because in the best guess for the image, it revealed that the image might have had something to do with a shadow box still life set. So from there I did a new search, searching for still life shadow box. We'll just go into the images here, and straight away I started to get a much more accurate representation of what Anatoly was doing. And here's the actual image that I was searching for. What we can see is that we've got a very enclosed setup where the lighting is tied in closely to the actual set. We've got these really big dishes. On top of that, in this reference, you can see that we've even got a window behind, which is going to naturally be producing fill light into the scene. So this just made things a lot easier to try and figure out what was actually going on. When you start seeing things like this and how modular these boxes are set up to be, you get a much better understanding of how to actually recreate his lighting. And now, as you can see, in most situations, we've only got 2 lights. There's not a massive array of lights, but the beauty of that is when you're working with so few lights, you've got to be very careful about where you place them, how intense they are, and how they blend together. Because essentially what you're trying to do is create more depth in the image, which is naturally going to pull the viewer's attention in more. But from here, I just needed to choose a bit of reference or choose one of his works that I could go in and learn from and try and recreate. And I ended up settling on this image here. You've probably seen me post it to Facebook. The reason why I liked this image was that it was quite detailed, and we had a couple of objects in the scene which could give off a sense of scale, like the skull, which some of his other scenes don't really have. On top of that, it just matches that same consistent lighting setup where we've got the backboard being lit and then there's a very subtle fill light in from the front. The other thing that I liked about this was that there wasn't a very obvious way of recreating the lighting, and that's something important to note because you're not always going to have really nice high-res detailed reference to recreate from and learn from. So when I'm trying to deal with a scene like this, it makes it a lot harder because in the reflective objects like you're seeing in the glass, it's very difficult to distinguish exactly what's going on simply because of the resolution and how small those objects are in the scene. So I knew it was going to be quite a big challenge, but through looking at the reference and looking at Anatoly's work and seeing that consistency, I knew that he wasn't going to have a million lights, so it was just going to be a matter of getting the couple of lights that he does have locked off, which led me down a path of having a better understanding about the importance of the size of your lights and the intensity of your lights, because everything has to balance to create nice tonality in the scene. You're going to see that as I progress through some of the more practical stuff. So I chose one of Anatoly's works, but rather than jumping straight into this particular scene, because once again, this is another step up in complexity, I'm going to load up a max scene that I've got prepared here to break down the importance of directional lighting versus indirect lighting. The easiest thing you can do to change around and think outside the box with this workflow is think of your primary light source as an indirect light source. Don't make that primary light the strongest that's aimed directly at the object. Instead, aim it at the back wall or aim it at a reflector where that light bounces back into the scene. So obviously one of the things that's been extremely exciting working on this lesson is having new hardware to actually do it on. Now, I've been working throughout this project with V-Ray's IPR mode, and thankfully now that I've also upgraded to the official release, a few of the bugs are fixed. So the first thing you're going to want to do to set up a scene like this is set your production rendering mode to V-Ray Advanced. From there, I only change a couple of things these days. I'm not changing any sampling or any stuff like that. It's all simple and easy, and V-Ray does everything for you, and it does it fast. I change the render time to 0. I leave everything else the same. It's 1 and 100, 0 and 0.005. The only thing you can really change with the progressive mode now to adjust the quality is this noise threshold. That's all you've got to do. If you raise it, it's going to be noisier. If you shrink it, it's going to be less noisy. I think for a scene that needs to be very clear, 0.005 is perfect. And in fact, I don't really even change from this because with progressive rendering, if I want to stop a render, I can. It's just a little bit noisier. The second thing I change when working with IPR mode and V-Ray is I set the GI to be brute force and brute force. Now this will make the end rendering a little bit slower, but it also makes it faster because every time you do a camera change or material tweak, it's not recalculating the light cache. You get an instant real-time feedback. And it's made things so much more like photography, it's a joke. So as I go up here, I've locked off the camera. Now, like what a real photographer is doing on a set, they'll be at the camera here, they're the ones pressing the button or they're at the shutter, but while they're looking through the viewfinder, they've got their assistant or on-set hand, whatever you want to call it, positioning the light based on his instruction. But as you can see, having this light aimed directly at the scene isn't the effect I'm going for here. So in order to create that, I'm just going to delete this light and I'm going to unhide a light I created previously and just turn that on. As you can see here, I've got a light aimed, and rather than, this will be my hero light by the way, rather than aiming this at the statue, it's kind of catching the back edge, but instead I've actually got it aimed at the back wall here. You can see that creates a really nice natural vignette. There might be some situations where you don't want any of that light catching on the object itself, and you might need to push it further behind, like so. You might need to even go lower as well. Now you can see that we're completely silhouetting the object from the back. Before I go any further, I've just gone back to having the light where it was. I want to emphasize the importance of the directionality inside the V-Ray lights. This is a new feature, and if you haven't worked with it, basically what this will do is it'll turn a light from an area light where all the light is kind of coming out from 180 degrees in all directions, and it will narrow that cone to be more like a flashlight. So let me just explain this. I'll go smaller on my preview so we can see more of a real-time effect happening here. I'm going to go back down to 0. Now you can see, having 0 directionality on the light, we're getting a very soft fill, and it's more even fill in the scene. This is more what's happening with area light or a softbox. Now, as I go and raise that value, and this is what I love about IPR mode, it's instant. It's not like RTGPU where you've got to make the change and then let it render. You can see what's happening here. It's turning it more and more into a flashlight, and I'm just going to unlock just to show you guys this. You can see that light from behind here is aiming directly at the wall. The next thing is that you'll notice that in this light there's like a small detail where the edge of the light is less intense. The reason for that is because I'm actually using an HDR texture for the light. Now I've got to be totally honest. Even though I'm using Jorgen's maps that he's got in his first release of this type of stuff, there's so much more I can do on this in the future in terms of getting studio lights, taking HDRs of them, and then calibrating them so that they behave the exact same way in CGI as they do on the real life set. So let me bring up the material editor here. Inside of Jorgen's emitter, HDR emitter volume 1, you'll see that you've got a couple of different options here. Now I want to massively overhaul this and get way more lights in, because now that I am doing more of this in-depth lighting theory, you've got to have the actual studio lights to imitate. You can't just, a professional photographer doesn't go onto a studio set and use a halogen light bulb from their kitchen to light a person. There's specific lighting setups that do specific things, and even though I don't have the time to break down all of that in this lesson, I promise I will get through that. So the light I ended up using was, where is it here? It was this lamp 01. So let me go into the HDR here. You can see it's down here, and let me drop the intensity. Now you can see some of that detail, and you simply don't get that if you don't use a texture. The other important thing to note is that the surface area of this light, the shadow will change depending on the intensity of different parts of the light. I won't get into that in this section, but I will break that down as we get closer to matching Anatoly's work. Now from here, we need to put a secondary light source in that's going to fill the left-hand bottom side of the object. As you can see here, the backlight's kind of catching this top right area, but we don't have any detail down the bottom left. So from here, I've duplicated this light that was aimed at the back wall, and I've just played with the directionality. I've done that so that I get a more even light over the surface. If I go too high, you can see here on the right, it creates a really strong spotlight. So I can balance that by going down on the intensity of the light. But then the problem is we've got a really small area where there's a strong hotspot, but then the rest of the scene looks quite dark. It's not a very even lighting. So obviously you can do a couple of things there. You can play with the distance of the light, but the goal here when you're filling the object is to create a nice even light that's not combative against the backlight. You don't want it too bright and you don't want it too dark where you're not getting any of the details. So I'm going to drop back on the directionality here, get a 0.45, and I'll raise the intensity of the light back up. Now you can see that I could probably even go in and balance this out because I've increased the intensity of this light so that I'm catching some nice indirect detail on the inside geometry you're seeing here. But now the problem is the backlight, which is meant to be our hero light, isn't as strong. So I can go into the backlight now and up the intensity of this, and I just want to get more light coming through there. So here, this is the whole point of the scene from this point. You've got your hero light at the back, you've got your fill light from the side, but in order to truly balance out the lighting in this scene, you've got two choices from here. You can add another fill light into the scene, aiming directly at the object, or we can start to familiarize ourselves with reflectors, which can be anything from professionally store-bought versions, which are, let me just bring those up for you. They come in many shapes and sizes. They're very cheap and affordable, and basically they're designed to redirect light from your primary light source and fill the scene with a much more soft indirect light source. Some photographers will consider reflectors as light sources, and technically speaking they are, but usually because they're a lot softer than your hero lights, it's just a bit of technical wording as to what you want to call them or refer to them as. On top of that, you've got different colors, and that will serve different purposes. Sometimes the gold can be used to complement an already gold looking scene. Usually they don't work if your lighting's too blue because it creates too much contrast. But the primary two types of reflectors a photographer will use are the silver ones and the white ones. The silver ones are designed to reflect back the most light, and the white reflectors are designed to reflect light the most evenly. So in our scene, we've got a hero light here. It's important to realize though that a reflector can essentially be anything. It doesn't have to be a professionally bought one. It can be a cloth. It can be a piece of wooden board. And after speaking to Anatoly, I've learned that he doesn't do anything expensive with his lighting. He's very minimal, very grungy with it, and will just use regular household items to get that look and feel. So the first thing I notice now from this point is that parts of this object have really nice detail in them, but still on this kind of front face here and on the side area, there's nothing. It's completely black. It doesn't look like it's balanced, especially when you've got that backlight filling in some areas. So we've got to fill these areas in with an additional light source. Now, like I said, I could duplicate this light and put it in, or I could do what a photographer does and simply create a piece of wood or bring in a piece of cloth to reflect back some of that light. Now this is where the importance of working with brute force and brute force really comes in, because with scenes that require a lot more global illumination to light the scene, you're going to want more realistic results, and you'll get that with brute force. So what I'll do here is I'll change the bounces to 15, and I'm going to make a box in the scene here and just drag this out and up. Like I said, it can be absolutely anything. And I'll just move this in next to the object. Let me make sure that it's right next to it. Now you can see by having this here, let me just make a V-Ray material for this. And I will always suggest putting in a little bit of reflection and just blurring it heavily, because that will help contribute to the light bouncing back in the scene. But now you can see that with this object directly next, the light coming from our secondary light is bouncing back in and filling in those details that looked a little bit off before. But from here, you can see that there's still some areas that are dark that aren't getting filled. So what can you do about that? Well, you've got the option of going in and moving the fill light to exactly where it needs to be. So what I can do is I can pull this in front of the object a bit more. Everything's locked off here. Now as I begin to move this around more, we're filling in those dark areas. Now I could essentially, like I said, use anything for this scene. If you're on a real life photography set and you want to introduce a little bit of brown, kind of teal lighting into the scene, you could use a piece of wood. If I go in and set the color of this board, you'll see just how much of an effect this is having. And you can see that placing the light just where we want, it fills it in all those areas that were lacking before. And this is where, as you get better at understanding traditional photography and the subtleties of light, you'll start to pick up on stuff like this, because the best photographers will do an amazing job at transitioning from one light to the next in terms of intensity and contrast. You won't see professional photographers work with like a really strong flashlight and then like another strong flashlight in another area, leaving some areas of the object kind of occluded. You want to try and create a really nice, even lighting around the scene that shows off all of the model. Now I've got to stress that if you're going to go down this path of working more with reflectors, you have to be prepared to pay the price in rendering time, because now we're not working with direct lighting, we're working with indirect lighting or global illumination. So I've got a couple of passes up here. You can see the lighting coming from the backlight and the front light is contributing, but in the lighting pass we're not getting anything from the reflection. That's because the lighting pass is only focusing on the first direct rays that hit the surface and not the secondary rays. Whereas when we're dealing with bounce light like we're seeing on the card here, we're going to get that. So now if I go to the global illumination pass, this is the effect we're getting from the combination of the two lights in the scene bouncing around and this fill board. So even though there's a cost in terms of render time, you get a different result than if you were rendering just with a simple light. So you've got to figure out the trade-off there, start to learn and adapt how reflectors can be used more effectively, and then make the decision about if you want to use them on a project. Because I can tell you now, when I worked with my scene, it was very slow to render, but I'd put so much work into all the assets. At that point, I just didn't care. If the render was going to take a day and a half to finish, so be it. You know, you've already put 250 hours of work into the assets and the texturing. What's another day and a half waiting? It's obviously not a realistic project in terms of time and, you know, where you're putting your effort and energy into, but I just wanted to showcase that you can work with indirect lighting heavily to make stuff look cool. So working with just a simple board like this it's all good. It's one particular way of working with reflectors, but you can go even further than this and do what I did on the final lighting setup. Now this isn't what Anatoly is doing, but it is something that you can experiment with. So I've got a light here aiming kind of at the object, and some of that light is bouncing back in. But now, let's just say, for example, I've got a light that's a bit further away. Now you can see that the effect that this is having, as I pull it more and more away from the object, it's reducing that global illumination. And you can see here it's becoming less and less. So what if I have a reflector in the scene somewhere that's far enough away from the object where it's bouncing in light in the right area, but we don't have enough light from the scene to actually bounce back off of. So our positioning is correct, but not the amount of light. So what I can do from here is I can take the light I've got on the left. Now I'm going to duplicate this, and just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to disable the front and back light we're seeing in the scene. And I'm going to aim the light at the reflector board we've got here. Now, a real-life photographer will put this offset a little bit, unless they're planning on retouching it out, which you also have to consider. And I'm going to go higher on the directionality. Now, none of the direct light is hitting the surface, and you can see as I drop down that directionality, because more light is coming out at these angles where we're getting hit there. I don't want that. I just want the fill light. So you go higher up on the directionality, just until that light's not hitting at all. Now you can see it's all purely indirect lighting. So let's turn back on the front and side light now. And let's change the color here back to being white. Now this might be too strong, so you've just got to play with that effect. But essentially what this has done is it's allowed me to move the reflector away from the set, because obviously before we had it right next to the object, and that's totally fine if you're prepared to render out in 2 passes and retouch together. Photographers do it all the time. But another solution, like I've shown now, is you can aim the light at the light source, and I've got to thank Daniil Hike for this, because after he came on the live stream with me that night, it just opened my eyes and I went down a different path of trying to figure out what to do. But straight away now you can see that the difference between having the reflector board directly next to the object and putting it a little bit further away and aiming a light source at the board creates a much softer fill. It's not so extreme, and all of the dark areas in the scene are being nice and evenly lit. So from here we've got 3 lights. 2 of them are not even aimed at the object at all, but the end result is that we've got a really nice evenly lit hero object, with the added benefit of having a really beautiful vignette around the scene that just helps you pull in. I could probably from here, having the floor like this, one thing I like to do is make it reflective, and if you want to use this scene to experiment and test on, I'll be providing this in the lesson. Let me just duplicate, and I'll just use shitty naming conventions for this. I've named so many files for this scene now that I've stopped caring completely about naming conventions. So now I've just made the floor a bit darker, which is just putting a bit more focus on the object itself. And I can just experiment with the intensity of the light source for filling, and it's always best just once you've got the setup there to experiment with that and figure out if it's correct. So I'm going to experiment. I'm going to double the light source here, intensity. It's most likely going to be too intense, but if you go overboard, you can reel it in a little bit. I don't like now how in the fill we've kind of lost a bit of detail. If I just turn this off, you can see on the leg, I still want some contrast between the left and right hand side. I just don't want this really sharp transition. And this is what I'm talking about mastering light and figuring out how to get those blends happening perfectly. Because that's what a photographer is looking out for. They don't just randomly put the fill light in and it works every time. They've got to experiment and position things correctly. So one thing you can do to achieve that is, say I've got this reflector board in the wrong place. And just to demonstrate this once again, I'm going to turn off the 2 secondary lights. So now all we're working with is that fill light. I can also do what Daniil suggested and group this as a singular object. Now I can move it around the scene without affecting anything else. And I can change where I want that fill light. Now once again, this is all, you go to the lighting pass, very little amount is actually hitting. this is all global illumination, and it will give you a different look and feel to having a direct light source hitting the surface. It's going to be softer in the shadows, and you'll notice a easier transition from the light to the dark using methods like this. And it's good to have these passes visible because it lets you know where that direct light is hitting. If I go to the lighting pass, you can see that even though the toe is hitting a little bit, things like that don't matter. But say, for example, I put the light here in the lighting pass, now you can see that we're influencing the direct lighting, which isn't what we want, unless it looks good. You know, there's always going to be that trade-off. But the goal in doing this and having that light hit this board is so that we can move it away, offset, and you can see working with the 2D pen and zoom, I've got greater control. Instead of just being zoomed in here and not being able to see where I've got the light in relation to the scene, I can zoom out and really interactively move this, for example, right up until the edge. And I also do this on the final scene. You know, I've got to position things just right, just off camera, just like a real photographer would, to keep everything consistent. I'm going to go to the global illumination pass. You can see here. I'm just going to open up this group. And I think 20 is a little bit too strong. I'll go back down to 12. Should have seen an effect there. It's just very subtle. And now I'm going to add in my other two lights. And I love working with this 2D pen and zoom for this stuff because at all times, and usually having 3 monitors, I'd have the render off to the left, full screen. And another thing I'm trying to get V-Ray and Chaos Group to implement is a full screen mode for V-Ray, because at this point, when you say you have 2 screens, I want one screen for the UI and the interface where I'm moving this stuff, and I want another screen that's just purely full screen, specifically for viewing and seeing the end result. Just gonna, whoops. Just gonna move this a little bit further away. And I'll render this high res just so you can see all the details popping off the object and how there is that nice transition. It's also good if you start working really low resolution, remember also that a photographer is zooming in and seeing stuff high res. So even though working in IPR mode can be really addictive, don't forget to sometimes have a little bit of patience, render off a larger resolution version and make some judgments, and then go back to working in real time. So we've got the high-res render up here. Now, unless you're extremely lucky, you're not going to get the lighting perfect the very first time you do one of these high-res renders. So you need to be able to critically and logically figure out where the problems are, just like you would with a shader lacking detail or something like that. You need to go in and learn how to fix your lighting. So like I said earlier in the lesson, the thing that a professional photographer will do differently to an amateur photographer is really blend the transition between different lights together. So let me make